Evening was drawing to a close, and the air in Rosewood, a small town in Virginia, was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and barbecue smoke. I stood by the window of my house, looking at the sunset casting its red and orange reflections across the valley. My thoughts once again drifted to the days when I was in the army, fighting in deserts on the other side of the world. My wife called me to the table, where dinner awaited. I tried to hide my thoughts, but she always sensed when something was bothering me. After dinner, I decided to go for a walk, hoping that fresh air would help me cope with my restless thoughts. I walked along a narrow path through the forest when I suddenly heard a quiet rustle. I stopped, listening to every sound. My heart beat faster. In the army, we were taught to be attentive to details, and this skill stayed with me even after returning home. Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind the trees. I immediately recognized my comrade in arms, Jack. But it was impossible. Jack had died during our last mission in Iraq. His face was pale and his eyes were empty. He came closer and I felt a chill that reached my bones. "You left me there," he said quietly, his voice sounding like the rustling of leaves in the wind. "Jack, that's not true. We did everything we could," I replied, but my words sounded unconvincing even to myself. Jack disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared. I stood there trying to understand what had happened. Maybe it was just a figment of my imagination, triggered by memories and guilt. I returned home, but peace did not come. At night, I had nightmares. I saw the faces of my fallen comrades, heard their voices, felt their pain. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding wildly. The next day, I decided to visit the local Veterans Memorial. Perhaps there I could find answers to my questions, or at least calm my soul a little. I stood in front of the monument, reading the names of those who had given their lives for the country. Jack was among them. Suddenly, I felt someone watching me. I turned and saw an elderly woman standing nearby. She approached me and quietly asked, "Did you know Jack?" "Yes, we served together," I replied. "He always talked about you. You were like a brother to him," she said, tears filling her eyes. I felt a wave of emotions wash over me. Maybe at that moment, I understood what needed to be done. That night, I decided to return to the place in the forest where I had seen Jack. I felt I had to meet him again to understand what he wanted from me. I took a flashlight and walked the same path. The forest was dark and quiet. Only the sounds of night birds and the rustling of leaves broke the silence. Suddenly, I heard the rustle again. The flashlight beam caught a familiar figure from the darkness. Jack stood before me, his face calm, but his eyes remained empty. "You need to help me," he said. "How can I help you?" I asked, not knowing what else to say. "You need to find what we left behind." His voice sounded like a whisper of the wind. I understood what he was talking about. During our last mission, we lost an important document that could change the course of the war. It was a classified file containing information about the enemy's location and plans. I was sure that this document had perished along with Jack. The next day, I decided to reach out to my old contacts in the army. I told them what I had seen, and they agreed to help me find this file. We gathered a small group of veterans and set off for the site of our last battle. It was dangerous, but I felt I had to do it. We reached the abandoned base where our last mission had taken place. The place looked deserted, but the sense of danger never left me. We thoroughly searched the area and finally found what we were looking for. The document was hidden in an old storage room. I returned to Rosewood with the document. When I came to the memorial where I first met the elderly woman, I felt that Jack's soul had finally found peace. The sense of guilt disappeared, and I realized that I had taken the right step. This story left a deep mark on my life. War always leaves scars, but sometimes you need to take an important step to find peace and tranquility. Sometimes, even after death, our comrades may need our help. And I was ready to do anything to help my friend, even if it meant meeting his ghost in a dark forest. My name is Adam, and I am a veteran of the U.S. Army. After returning from the war in the Middle East, I sought a peaceful life in a small town in Texas. But it seemed that the war did not want to leave me. It started with small things. I often heard strange noises outside my window at night, whispers that penetrated the walls of my house. At first, I thought it was just the aftermath of post-traumatic stress disorder, but the sounds became more distinct. One night, I woke up with the feeling that someone was standing next to my bed. I quickly turned on the light, but the room was empty. Cold sweat covered my body, and I felt fear begin to consume me. The next day, I decided to install surveillance cameras around my house. A few nights later, reviewing the recordings, I saw something terrifying. A figure in dark clothing was slowly moving by my window, but when I approached the window to look, there was no one there. It was impossible. I began to doubt my sanity. The following weeks turned into a nightmare. Every night the figure appeared again, each time getting closer. One time I dared to go outside with a weapon in hand. When I approached the spot where I last saw it on the cameras, the figure disappeared, leaving only a faint smell of smoke behind. Exhausted and drained, I reached out to my old army buddy, Michael. He agreed to come and spend a few nights at my house. The first night was quiet, but on the second night, as we sat in the living room, the lights suddenly went out. "Did you hear that?" Michael whispered. We both heard a quiet whisper coming from the kitchen. Armed, we slowly approached the door. Opening it, we saw the same figure standing in the dark, staring right at us. "What do you want?" I shouted, but there was only silence in response. The figure disappeared, leaving behind a sense of horror. We returned to the living room, only to find another eerie scene. All our pictures on the walls were turned upside down, and on the table was a note that read, "The war is not over." The next morning, Michael left, promising to return with reinforcements. I was left alone, feeling that something terrible was approaching. That night, I barely slept, constantly hearing footsteps behind the door. At 3 a.m, I woke up to a loud crash. Stepping out of my room, I saw that all the doors in the house were open, and there was blood on the living room floor. I grabbed my phone and dialed Michael's number, but there was no answer. Panicking, I began to review the camera recordings again. What I saw froze me in place. The figure entered the house, but this time its face was visible. It was Michael. Not believing my eyes, I turned off the camera and heard someone walking up the stairs. Armed, I went up, but there was no one there. The feeling of being hunted became unbearable. I decided that I needed to leave this house and go as far away as possible. While packing my things, I heard the whisper again. Turning around, I saw Michael standing in the doorway of my bedroom, his eyes glowing with hatred. He slowly approached me, and I realized this was not the Michael I knew. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, but he did not answer. His hands tightened around my throat, and I felt life slowly slipping away from me. In the last moment, I managed to grab a knife and stabbed him. Michael released me, and I crawled into the hallway, gasping for breath. Standing up, I saw that Michael had disappeared again. The feeling of dread and fear overwhelmed me. I knew I had to leave this house immediately. Gathering the last of my things, I noticed the basement door was open. Descending there, I saw something I will never forget. The walls of the basement were covered with inscriptions. "The war is not over." In the center of the room stood a figure, and as I approached, I realized it was Michael's body. I ran out of the basement and got into my car, not looking back. I drove away, leaving this horror behind. But even now, far from that place, I feel that the war is not over. It haunts me, reminding me of the darkness that will always be at my back. It was an ordinary evening at the control center of our military base in the United States. Ordinary until a distressing message came through. I am Lieutenant Jackson, the commanding officer of a reconnaissance company, and I received orders to investigate a remote forest area where a group of soldiers had mysteriously disappeared. Immediately after receiving the orders, I gathered my team. 6 of the best military scouts, Sergeant Michaels, Corporal Smith, Privates Harris, Brown, Lee, and Jones. We set off for the site in 2 jeeps filled with equipment and ammunition. Our destination was an old military training ground that had been closed since the 80s. This area had long become a place of legends and scary stories among the soldiers, but none of us believed in them. We were professionals, not children, to be afraid of imaginary monsters. When we reached the forest, night had already fallen. We set up camp and assigned watches. At first, everything was calm, but around 2 a.m. we heard strange sounds from deep in the forest. They were like moans, but deeper and more eerie. I ordered Michaels and Lee to conduct a reconnaissance, while I stayed with the rest of the group, watching their progress through binoculars. They disappeared into the darkness, and soon our communication with them was lost. Suddenly, our radios came alive. It was Michaels. He was screaming that they had found something unbelievable, but the signal abruptly cut off. We set out to find them, taking everything necessary with us. When we reached the spot where they had vanished, we found a bizarre scene. Their weapons lay on the ground, but neither Michaels nor Lee were there. Instead, we found an old, overgrown building that seemed to have been abandoned for decades. Inside, it was dark and cool. We entered, illuminating our path with flashlights. Everywhere were old military artifacts, but nothing indicated that the place could be dangerous. As we examined the building, the door suddenly slammed shut behind us with a loud bang. Sergeant Michaels came back on the radio. His voice was quiet, as if he were very far away. He warned us to leave the place immediately. But the exit was blocked, and we had no choice but to continue our exploration. We split into 2 groups. I stayed with Smith and Jones, while Harris and Brown took another corridor. Every step echoed in the darkness, creating the feeling that we were being watched. On the walls, we began to notice strange symbols drawn in blood. Suddenly, we heard Harris scream. We rushed to the sound and found him lying on the floor, covered in blood. He was barely breathing and whispered something about shadows before dying. Brown was nowhere to be found. Smith started to panic, but I ordered him to pull himself together. We needed to find a way out and save the others. We continued moving when strange figures began to approach us from the darkness. They looked like people, but their faces were blurred and their movements were unnatural. Jones opened fire, but the bullets passed through them, causing no harm. These shadows started to surround us. We retreated to a room with a single window. I realized this was our only chance for escape. I smashed the window and helped Jones and Smith climb out. We ran without looking back. The forest seemed endless, but finally we reached our camp. All 3 of us were exhausted but alive. In the morning, we called for reinforcements and evacuated from that sinister area. When we returned to the base, we were greeted as heroes, but none of us felt like one. We had lost friends and seen things that should not exist. We vowed never to return to that forest and to keep these events a secret. However, at night, I still hear those strange sounds and see those eerie figures in my dreams. They remind me that sometimes it's better to leave the past in the past because some secrets are too dangerous to uncover. A month had passed since we returned from that fateful mission. I thought time would heal our wounds, but the fear and anxiety only intensified. The other team members began complaining of nightmares and strange occurrences. Smith admitted he felt like he was being watched even in his own home. Jones became silent and withdrawn, often losing touch with reality. One evening, as I was driving home from the base, I noticed the lights in my house flickering. I walked inside and felt a cold breeze, even though all the windows were closed. Quiet voices whispered my name in the room. I felt goosebumps rise on my skin, and my heart started pounding faster. I decided to go to the basement where I kept all my old military records and gear. When I entered, I saw that all my documents were scattered on the floor, and the same symbols we saw in the forest were on the walls. Cold sweat trickled down my back. Suddenly, the lights went out, leaving me in complete darkness. My mind began to draw the most horrific images. I remembered Michael's words about shadows. It was not a myth, but a reality. They had come for us. I heard heavy footsteps behind me and turned around but saw nothing. Then I realized they were already here. I burst out of the basement, slammed the door shut, and barricaded it with furniture. But it didn't help. All the lamps in the house began to flicker, and those same figures emerged from the darkness. They were approaching me, their faces remaining blurred and inhuman. I ran out of the house and rushed to my car. The connection to the base was cut off, and I didn't know where else to turn for help. I just drove, not stopping until I reached a deserted road where I stopped to catch my breath. The night was dark, and I felt I was not alone. Those figures appeared from the darkness again. They were coming toward me, their faces still blurred and inhuman. I realized that escape was impossible. The shadows would always find me. In those last seconds, I felt the shadows engulf me like a cold, invisible fog. My consciousness drowned in darkness, leaving only a sense of fear and hopelessness. This story serves as a warning. Sometimes it's better to leave the past in the past because some secrets are too dangerous to uncover. Sometimes the shadows of the past can catch up with you, even on the brightest day.